My grandfather got angry like bright white ceramic plates smashing against a tile floor. There was a sudden noise, everyone froze, cringed, allowed the shock to wash over them, and then quickly scrambled to pick up the pieces. From the mundane to the serious, his fury came lashing out at all moments. When his shirt wasn't ironed properly, when the chicken was too salty, or when someone in town killed his favorite dog by mixing broken bits of glass into its food. He was active with the local Communist Party and always walked around with a tempest brewing in his wake, and he went through most of his life without a single person ever questioning his decisions or opinions. Growing up, my mother hoped that as her father aged, he might soften around the edges or lose some of that rage that was always quaking just below the surface. They say that anger is a sword that blunts with time, but by the time she had reached her 20s, she had lost all hope. She was 25 when she met my dad at a hospital in Delhi. She was working as a nurse, and he was finishing his residency. After months of planning and plotting, they traveled back to Kerala, and my father visited her house to ask for her hand in marriage. This conversation didn't last long. My grandfather flew out of his seat like someone had lit a fire underneath him. A Hindu boy crossing his doorstep to ask for his good Christian daughter's hand in marriage. He lost every nut and bolt that held his barely temperate personality together and yelled till his voice grew hoarse. He walked around for days, angrily hitching up his lungi, spitting and grumbling to himself, as combustible as a box of matches. At this time, my mother moved to the Middle East to work as a nurse for a year. Rather than write letters, she and my dad would record messages to each other on cassette tapes that they would send by post across the Arabian Sea. It always makes me smile to think of these tapes moving slowly across the water, undeterred by weather and obstacles, as patient as their love. She became more and more sure of what she had to do next, so she wrote home to her family. "I'm getting married on November 9th. You are all invited. Please come." On her wedding day, my mother looked incredible. In a sari made completely out of gold thread, she was draped in necklaces and earrings and bangles. The wedding videos show her floating through the frame with a smile that looks half dreamy, half invented for the occasion. You get a sense of dislocation watching her in the shots. She's present, but also very far away. As the story goes, no one in her family responded to her invitation. So how does a body do it? How do you spend a whole day laughing when there's nothing but turmoil on the inside? How do you swallow both bliss and melancholy in one mouthful? She had fought for months for the courage to marry my dad, and on the day of their wedding, she felt like she was discarding half of herself in exchange for new parts. She even changed her name, from a Christian one to a Hindu one. From Susamma, she became Sarita. Years after the wedding, years after both my sister and me were born, my mother ran into her brother in a market, who immediately turned and walked off in the opposite direction. By this time, she had lost all hope, but to say that this incident didn't bother her would be a lie. My mom remained in touch with one of her cousins who would secretly deliver pictures of us to my grandmother. My aunt once snuck by the house. I was 4, and I still have this blurry, ethereal memory of braiding her long hair and falling in love with the idea of my mom having a secret sister. I never saw her again, and I was never told why. When I was 10, I met one of my mom's extended cousins on a trip back to India from the US. I always referred to him as an uncle. He had moved to Australia to marry an Australian woman, then got divorced. Somehow, no one ever stopped talking to him. One day he offered to take me and my sister around for a drive. I wasn't really keen on sitting in the car for an hour with someone who was effectively a stranger, but he insisted. My mom was shopping. After 30 minutes of driving along the highway, we turned onto a small side road which eventually became a tiny dirt path that was only wide enough to fit one car. Bright-colored houses with chickens roaming the front yard moved past my window like a film reel. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Just to visit some friends," he said. My sister and I exchanged looks. Yet another one of those polite house visits where we would be made to eat Parle-G biscuits and plantain chips and drink juice and drink milk with Horlicks powder, all the while sitting smartly in a chair for an hour listening to innocuous conversation with dull strangers, sometimes forwarding aggressive questions of why we were so sickly looking. Didn't our mother feed us properly in America? I was not thrilled. We pulled into the front yard of a modest one-story house. An old man emerged from inside. He paused at the bottom of the steps and surveyed the car for a while, trying to make out who was inside through the glare in the windshield. No one opened the door or made a move to get out. A voice came to the front door. "Did you find out who it is?" she asked. Then she came down the stairs. The frailest jumble of bones, the littlest old lady I had ever seen. Her eyes were as wide as saucers, and she had no teeth. The old man came forward to greet my uncle, and at that moment saw my sister and me in the back seat. I was 10, and she was 8, and we were both grumpy and squirming. He pulled open the door to my left, and I timidly stepped out into the sun, trying not to make eye contact. There was a quick noise, as if a sound got caught in the back of someone's throat, and suddenly I was engulfed by his arms and deafened by an inexplicable crying. My body stiffened to a board, and I did my best to stay politely still, even though I had every desire to jump back in the car and shut the door. Meanwhile, my sister, who had stepped out on the other side of the car, was experiencing a similar trauma with the old lady. She was being kissed over and over again by this woman, and I looked at my uncle for a little help, but he was just standing off to the side. Then they switched. The old man started crying and hugging my sister, and the old lady started making her way towards me, and it was all I could do to stand my ground and not run in the opposite direction, but before I knew it, she was collapsing into my 10-year-old arms. She was barely taller than me. I was completely stumped. This was way more than the typical house call and spin around town. Explanations were in order. Then, as simply as if we were discussing the weather, there was an awkward laugh, and my uncle said, "These are your grandparents." "Who?" I asked stupidly. "Them." I looked back at the two of them. They stepped away from us, sheepishly drying their tears and choking over their breath. There was a sudden shuffling into the house. My sister and I sat at an oversized dinner table with a spread of snacks enough to feed 10 people. When they noticed that neither of us had touched anything, my grandfather asked, "Do you two not like biscuits? What do you like? Anything you like, I can get it for you." Then he called out for my grandmother in the kitchen, "Can you bring the girls some rice and chicken? They're not eating the biscuits." There was a clanging of plates and pots in the kitchen. We ate chicken curry, and they stood off to the side, intently watching us take each bite very carefully, unsure if we were used to eating such things in the US. Growing up, I had bugged my mom with endless questions about her parents. I was fascinated by the fact that she, like me, had a mom and a dad. What did they look like? Did they resemble her? What kind of house did they live in? Did they miss her? She only ever gave vague, short answers and always changed the subject. Suddenly, in a mostly anticlimactic meeting, I had answered all those questions. They look quite old and unremarkable, actually. Neither of them looked like my mom. They live in a small house with 6 rooms. And I was sure they missed her a lot, by the way they cried when they held me and my sister. In the car ride back home, my 10-year-old mind was suddenly seized by a brilliant idea. I had to reunite my mom with her parents. When we arrived home, I rushed to my mom's side. "Where did you guys go?" she asked. "Can you guess?" I asked. She smiled. "To the ice cream shop?" "No. We went to see your mom and dad." "Who?" "We went to see your mom and dad. Sonny uncle took us to your old house, and I met your mom and your dad, and they fed us chicken curry." She stared at me as if I had gone completely insane. She didn't speak for a couple seconds, so I kept plying on, thoroughly enjoying the surprise I was revealing. "They said I should come back tomorrow." "They said that?" "Yeah, I told them I would come back and I would bring you with me." "We're not going anywhere tomorrow." "They're not mad at you anymore," I assured her very matter-of-factly, as if I had seriously conferred with them on this issue. "They want to see you." "Listen, they don't want to see me, and they don't want to see you. You're not going back there anymore." There's a black and white photo hanging unceremoniously on the wall near the front door of my grandparents' house. When I first saw it, I didn't even have to ask. It was a picture of my 3-year-old mother standing with her mom and dad on both sides, all three of them looking sufficiently depressed, as people are wont to do in those vintage photographs before smiling was fashionable. Whenever I look at that photograph, though, I get chills. You can never predict the things you'll have to endure in life. At times, your life seems so ordinary and normal, and at other times, you are overwhelmed by this extraordinary sadness you have to bear, and you wonder, how many others have gone through this? For almost 12 years, my mom had been slowly rebuilding herself. She had moved halfway across the world to start a new life, had fully accepted that her father would never forgive her or even accept her children as an olive branch, and yet all of a sudden, here was her 10-year-old daughter, the one that she had worked so hard to insulate from the sadness, tugging at her clothes, begging her to make amends. After everything she had been through, this was possibly the cruelest part of it all. After endless hours of pleading and whining, I remember getting into a white Ambassador. My mother sat in the middle, my sister and I on either side of her. I was squirming in my seat with excitement and self-satisfaction, but my mom grew paler and paler as we neared town. We finally turned onto a dirt path that was only wide enough for one car to pass through. Bright-colored houses with chickens roaming the front yard moved past my window like a film reel. A woman was standing at her gate, and as we passed, I saw her eyes widen as she recognized a face in the car. I heard her say something loud enough for others to hear, and suddenly curtains moved, doors went ajar, and heads were popping out of windows, and people were literally spilling out of their homes to see if it was real. Was it true? Was that cranky old Varky's daughter finally returned? Echoes reverberated through town. People were rushing out of their homes, calling out, "Elsa Ma's back! Elsa Ma's back! Did you hear?" My mother looked like she was going to faint, and when I turned around in my seat, I realized that over 20 people were following the car, banging on the back of it, chanting and yelling, "She's back! She's back!" And I looked at my mom with whole new eyes. Was this really happening? By the time we reached my grandparents' house, everything was clouded in a blur. Everyone collapsed into each other's arms, and bodies were clinging to each other while my sister and I stood amongst it all, feeling like we were drowning in a sea of weeping giants. I remember my grandfather crying a lot, losing complete control of himself. And I realized he's a man of extremes. He cries as shamelessly as he reprimands, and he holds on to love as fiercely as he does to anger. When I finally got a moment in the corner with my mom, I turned to her and asked her very seriously, "Are you a celebrity?" I will never forget the way she laughed, and the way my grandmother laughed, and all the aunties standing around us said, we all felt we had lost a daughter too, and now she's back. She was a celebrity, at least that day. So the perfect fairy tale would end here. But like real life, the story goes on. It would be a cop-out to say that the magnitude of the emotion that my mom and her dad felt upon being reunited suddenly healed all wounds. I have watched everyone struggle in the aftermath. I realize that although the separation seems rooted back to one explosive moment, that if my grandfather had listened for a moment, or if he hadn't let his anger overshadow his love, then maybe things would have been different. But it's not entirely true. People are propelled forward by a fury or a hurt that has turned toxic inside them, and before they know it, they're 12 years out with no point to prove and a whole lot of emptiness and regret. Forgiveness does not magically sprout from a decade of separation. Forgiveness is a constant action, something you have to wield like a weapon, because it is a volatile, raw sort of emotion that will be questioned and even attacked. You will forgive, but there will be moments when a shirt isn't ironed properly, when the chicken is too salty, a ceramic plate that crashes to the kitchen floor might lead you to pause and wonder what it was all for, and admit that he hasn't changed at all. But you'll realize that forgiveness can be a selfish thing too. You do it not because the other person deserves it, but because you do.